Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where old stories are allowed to speak slowly and the past is given time to breathe. Tonight the focus settles gently on ancient clay tablets shaped by hands that lived thousands of years ago. Hands that pressed symbols into wet earth without knowing how far those marks would travel. These texts were not written to impress us or to mystify. They were practical, administrative, and sometimes deeply anxious. Within them lies a recurring theme that feels less like legend and more like pressure. A sense that something had gone wrong elsewhere, long before the first cities rose between the rivers. The Sumerians did not describe the Anunnaki arriving out of curiosity, but as a response to a crisis that could no longer be ignored. What survives instead is a tone shaped by obligation, scarcity, and necessity. For now, there is no hurry. Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where old stories are allowed to speak slowly and the past is given time to breathe. Tonight, the focus settles gently on a set of ancient clay tablets shaped by hands that lived thousands of years ago. Hands that pressed symbols into wet earth without knowing how far those marks would travel. These texts were not written to impress us or to mystify future generations. They were practical, administrative, and sometimes deeply anxious. Within them lies a recurring theme that feels less like legend and more like pressure. A sense that something had gone wrong elsewhere, long before the first cities rose between the rivers. If this space brings you any sense of calm, if the steady unfolding of old ideas helps the noise of the day loosen its grip, we can allow the past to breathe together. For now, there is no hurry. The Sumerian canon is not a single book or a unified scripture. It is a vast, fragmented archive of memory. It is a collection of thousands of tablets, some no larger than a palm, others heavy and imposing. When we look at these artifacts, we are looking at the foundational records of a civilization that claimed its knowledge was a gift. But the language of that gift is surprisingly heavy. The Sumerians did not describe their gods arriving out of curiosity. They did not frame their presence as a grand exploration or a benevolent descent motivated by wonder. What survives instead is a different tone altogether, one shaped by obligation, scarcity, and necessity. The language used in these tablets carries weight. It speaks of labor, of burden, and of decisions made because alternatives were disappearing. When read carefully without modern assumptions layered over them, the narrative that emerges is not one of visitors seeking adventure, but of beings responding to a crisis that could no longer be ignored. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the earliest texts, are not distant abstractions. They are administrators, supervisors, planners, and enforcers of order. Their authority is described in functional terms. They measure, they allocate, they command, and they judge. Their hierarchy is clear and their duties are assigned. This is not the language of myth as entertainment. It is the language of systems under strain. Tonight, we look toward the source of that strain. We turn our attention away from the soil of the earth and look toward the source of the arrival. Long before the first surveyor set foot in the marshes of the south, there was a world in crisis. In the administrative language of the tablets, this world is referred to as Nibiru. It is not described as a paradise or a distant heaven of perfect peace. It appears instead as a system under immense and growing pressure. The scribes do not use poetic language to describe its decline. They do not speak of a tragic fall from grace or a moral failure that led to its instability. Instead, they record the mechanics of survival. They document a shift in environmental conditions that made continuity impossible without direct intervention. This framing is essential to understanding the celestial sovereignty of the Anunnaki. They did not come to Earth out of a desire for expansion. They did not arrive as explorers seeking the unknown. They came because their own world had become a place of scarcity, specifically the scarcity of protection. The tablets speak of a world where the atmosphere was thinning, where the balance of life was drifting toward a critical threshold that could no longer be ignored. There are references to the heat of the sun becoming difficult to bear and the coolness of the cycle failing to return in its proper measure. These are not descriptions of weather as we understand it. They are descriptions of a failing shield. In the logic of the tablets, the sky of Nibiru required active maintenance. It was not a self-sustaining canopy that existed beyond the reach of change. It was a managed environment. When the management of that environment began to fail, the consequences were described as immediate, systemic, and unavoidable. The response of the Anunnaki was not panic. It was a cold calculation of resources and time. One substance appears in the records with a frequency that signals its absolute importance: gold. In modern interpretations, gold is often seen as a symbol of wealth, but in the earliest Sumerian accounts, gold is treated as a substance of function. It is listed alongside materials used for sealing, for protection, and for restoration. The texts do not describe it as something to be traded or hoarded for its beauty. They describe it as something to be used. When read through the lens of a civilization facing an atmospheric crisis, the role of gold becomes instrumental. It was the material needed to mend the sky. By creating a particulate shield in the upper reaches of their environment, the Anunnaki sought to reflect the harshness of the cosmic radiation and retain the warmth of the world within. This was not a project of vanity. It was a project of desperation. The tablets record the councils that met to discuss this requirement. They document the assessments of how much material would be needed and where it might be found. Nibiru itself, though described as rich in many things, lacked the volume of gold necessary for a sustained restoration of its atmosphere. The crisis was not just that the sky was failing. The crisis was that the solution was out of reach. This is the moment where the narrative shifts from internal management to an external search. The heavens were surveyed, not for wonder, but for materials. The Sumerian scribes describe this search in terms that feel remarkably bureaucratic. There are lists of locations, measurements of distances, and evaluations of suitability. Earth was not chosen because it was beautiful. It was chosen because it was a repository. It contained the specific substance required to stabilize a dying home. The arrival on Earth was therefore an industrial expedition, not a spiritual descent. The Anunnaki were administrators, engineers, and workers who had been assigned a task upon which their entire civilization depended. The weight of this responsibility is visible in the language of the tablets. It is heavy, urgent, and precise. The decline of the home world is described as a gradual and relentless process. It was not a sudden catastrophe that forced an immediate flight. It was a slow thinning of the margins. Year by year, the cycles became less predictable. The harvests mentioned in the earliest fragments began to fail. The water became harder to regulate. These are the markers of environmental drift. Notably absent from these early passages is any suggestion that the Anunnaki existed outside of this instability. They were not immune observers. They were participants within a system that was failing. Their status was high, but their responsibilities were clearly defined. They answered to structure. They operated within limits. This practical tone runs throughout the earliest records. The scribes were not concerned with telling a dramatic story. They were concerned with preserving information that mattered. There is no nostalgia for a golden age in the sky, no lament for what was lost, The focus remains on what must be done. When we read these ancient texts without the layer of later myth, we see a civilization that reached across the stars for survival only to find itself burdened by the labor of its own salvation. The atmosphere of Nibiru, thin and failing, was the pressure that shaped the world of man. It was the reason the tablets were written, and it is the reason the past still speaks with such quiet urgency. The crisis was the beginning. Everything else was the response. The focus shifts from the sky of the home world to the dust of the earth. The administrators have arrived. The survey is complete. The work is ready to begin. The Sumerian scribes did not frame this as a warning. They recorded it as history. Their concern was continuity, preserving what had been established, and ensuring that the structures left behind continued to function. As the narrative moves forward, the tone continues to shift. What began as urgency becomes governance. What was once survival becomes legacy. Humanity inherits a world shaped by decisions made long before it could consent or object. The tablets remain silent witnesses to motivations that feel uncomfortably practical. There is no neat conclusion offered, no moral resolution, just a sense that something was set in motion and that its momentum carried forward through generations. The Anunnaki fade from direct involvement, but their influence persists in laws, myths, and hierarchies. The story does not end here. It simply changes its focus, moving from arrival to consequence, and from necessity to inheritance. The quiet weight of those ancient decisions continues to shape what comes next. Long before Earth is described as a destination, the oldest Sumerian tablets turn their attention upward, not in wonder, but in record. The sky, as it appears in these texts, is not a distant abstraction. It is active, structured, governed, and at times unstable. The heavens are treated as a place where events occur, where order can be disrupted, and where consequences ripple outward. Something about the cosmic environment was described as becoming difficult to manage. Decisions were made, councils convened, and authority figures intervened. This implies that whatever was unfolding in the heavens carried real risk, not just symbolic meaning. The difference here lies in specificity. The tablets do not speak in vague terms. They reference processes, movements, and cycles. The heavens were not simply watched. They were managed. This suggests a level of engagement that goes beyond ritual observation. The concept of scarcity appears subtly but persistently. Not scarcity of space, but of stability. The texts imply that certain materials essential to maintaining order were becoming harder to sustain. This is not stated outright. Instead, it is inferred through emphasis. When something is mentioned repeatedly in administrative texts, it usually signals importance under pressure. Gold, even at this early stage, is mentioned in connection with the heavens. It is not treated as treasure, but as a substance tied to function. It appears in lists of materials associated with maintenance and restoration. This alone establishes continuity. The same substance later sought on Earth was already significant before Earth enters the narrative. The heavens then were not a paradise lost through pride. They were a system under stress. The tablets do not moralize this stress. They document it. This suggests that the crisis, whatever its nature, unfolded gradually enough to normalize adaptation. When survival depends on adjustment, longing becomes a luxury. The heavens are also described as cyclical, but not eternally so. Cycles can degrade. Patterns can drift. When this happens, intervention is required. Stability is not permanent. It must be maintained, sometimes at increasing cost. The role of leaders like Enlil and Enki is hinted at through functions. One oversees order and command. The other oversees adaptation and problem-solving. This division of roles appears first in the heavens. Only later does it extend to Earth. The pattern is consistent. The same strategies used above are applied below. Even the highest figures operate within constraints. Decisions require consensus. Disputes arise. Authority is not absolute. If the Anunnaki were omnipotent, there would be no need for deliberation. The presence of debate implies uncertainty. The heavens were no longer reliable. Something essential was becoming harder to sustain, and ignoring it was no longer an option. Earth does not appear yet as a solution, but the groundwork is laid. The problem is established. The tone is set. The sky, once stable enough to fade into the background, has become a source of concern. Attention shifts outward, not in curiosity, but in necessity. The heavens have been assessed and their limits acknowledged. What comes next follows naturally from that realization, as attention turns toward a world that had not yet been chosen, but had already been noticed. One marked in the clay as a place of potential, not because of its beauty, but because of its utility. This is the beginning of the decoding, the slow peeling back of the administrative layer to see the crisis that brought the heavens down to the dust of the earth. For now, there is no hurry. When the first descent is recorded in the oldest Sumerian lists, the language does not shift into a higher register of celebration. It remains tethered to the ground, to the mud, and to the specific requirements of the mission. The arrival is not described as a triumph of the spirit. It is described as a placement of resources. The site chosen was Eridu, a location that would later be remembered as the first city, but which began as something far more practical. It was a station. It was a site selected for its proximity to what was needed and for its capacity to support the first phase of operations. The texts do not describe the builders arriving with songs. They describe them arriving with tools. They describe them measuring the marshes, assessing the flow of the water, and establishing a perimeter. This was the beginning of the material presence of the Anunnaki on Earth, and the tone of the records suggests that every move was calculated under the weight of the emergency that had driven them there. The figure at the center of this establishment is Enki, also known as Nudimmud, the master of the deep. In later mythologies, his domain is described in poetic terms as a subterranean ocean of sweet water. But in the earliest administrative layers, his role is much more technical. He is the engineer. He is the one who understands the properties of the environment and the requirements of the systems that must be built. The Apsu, the deep water associated with his name, is not presented as a mystical realm in these early notes. It is presented as a resource for cooling, for power, and for the management of the station. Enki does not enter the marsh out of a love for nature. He enters it because it provides the necessary conditions for the work that must be done. The choice of Eridu was strategic. It was a place where the earth and the water met in a way that could be manipulated. The texts speak of the 50 who descended with him. This number is repeated across different versions of the story, and it suggests a specific crew size. It was a team of specialists. They were not settlers. They were technicians tasked with building the first house, the Iabzu. We are told that this house was built from the reeds of the marsh and the mud of the bank. But its purpose was not domestic. It was the hub of the station. It was where the decrees, the Mi, were kept. In later stories, the Mi are treated as magical objects or divine powers. But when read through the lens of these early administrative records, they behave like technical specifications. They are the blueprints. They are the protocols for agriculture, for metallurgy, for governance, and for the maintenance of order. To hold the me was to hold the instructions for the system. Enki established Eridu as the place where these instructions would be enacted. There is a sense of immense isolation in these early descriptions. The texts do not mention other cities because there were none. They do not mention other civilizations because the mission was the only organized presence on the planet. The environment is described as viable but demanding. The marshes were thick, the heat was persistent, and the work was slow. This was the long emergency transitioning from a plan into a physical reality. The first 72 days are often cited as a period of intense labor, a time when the first foundations were laid against the resistance of the swamp. The language used is one of measurement and allocation. So much mud was moved, so many reeds were cut, so much land was reclaimed from the water. This is not the vocabulary of myth. It is the vocabulary of a construction log. The arrival of the seven, often referred to as the Abgal or the Apkallu, is a recurring theme in the memory of Eridu. These figures are described as emerging from the water, often depicted in later art as wearing fish-like garments. While this has been interpreted symbolically for centuries, the earliest records frame them as teachers and experts. They brought with them the knowledge required to stabilize the environment. They did not bring poetry. They brought the knowledge of how to drain the land, how to build canals, and how to organize the first rudimentary forms of industry. The Abgal were the ones who implemented the me under the direction of Enki. They were the ones who turned the station into a functioning site. Their association with the water may reflect the reality of their work in the marshes, or perhaps the nature of their arrival. But their impact was entirely structural. They established the rules by which the station would function. As Eridu took shape, the pressure of the mission began to manifest in the way the station was managed. The texts describe a hierarchy that was strict and functional. Enki oversaw the technical operations, while his brother Enlil remained in the heavens, overseeing the broader strategy and the flow of resources. This division created a tension that would define the entire history of the Anunnaki on Earth. One was focused on the ground, on the adaptation of the system to the local environment. The other was focused on the objectives of the homeland. Eridu was the site where these two perspectives met. It was the place where the abstract requirements of Nibiru had to be translated into the mud of the earth. The records suggest that this translation was never perfect. There were disputes over priorities. There were complaints about the difficulty of the work. There was a sense that the station was never quite enough to meet the demand. The naming of Eridu is itself a significant act. In many interpretations, the name carries the meaning of the distant home or the house built afar. It was a reminder of what had been left behind, but it was also a declaration of presence. By naming the site, they were claiming it as part of their administrative structure. It was no longer just a marsh. It was a coordinate. It was a point on a map that now included the Earth. The establishment of the station marked the end of the survey phase and the beginning of the operational phase. The time for observation had passed. The time for extraction and management had begun. The clay tablets record this transition with a quiet gravity. They do not describe the beauty of the sunset over the water. They describe the completion of the first canals. One of the most telling details in the records of Eridu is the focus on the water systems. Enki is repeatedly praised for his ability to direct the flow of the rivers. This was not an act of worship. It was an act of survival. In a world where the mission depended on stability, the management of water was the most critical task. Without it, the station could not be cooled. Without it, the personnel could not be sustained. Without it, the resources could not be transported. The Iabzu was positioned at the very edge of the deep water, allowing the crew to monitor and manipulate the environment with precision. The language of the text suggests that the Apsu was a tool, a complex mechanism that Enki understood better than anyone else. He was the master of the deep because he was the master of the system that kept the station alive. The isolation of the first crew meant that they had to be entirely self-sufficient. There were no supply lines from other parts of the world. Everything had to be manufactured or extracted on site. This placed an immense burden on the 50 who descended. They were the architects, the laborers, and the administrators of a new world. The texts reflect a society that was entirely oriented toward the completion of the mission. There was no room for leisure. There was no room for deviation. Every hour was accounted for. Every resource was allocated. This was the reality of the station at Eridu. It was a high-stakes operation conducted in an environment that was indifferent to their survival. The silence of the marshes around them was a constant reminder of how far they were from the homeland and how much depended on their success. The descent of the Seven and the establishment of Eridu represent the first time that the logic of the heavens was imposed on the earth. Before this, the planet had its own rhythms, its own cycles, and its own balance. After the station was built, a new layer was added. A layer of rules, of measurements, and of goals. The earth was now part of a larger plan. It was no longer a wild place. It was an asset. The tablets do not reflect on whether this was a positive or negative development. They simply record it as a fact. The station was there. The Mi were in place. The work had begun. The momentum of the mission was now physical. It was carved into the land in the form of canals and buildings. As the years passed and the station grew, the records show that Eridu became the template for everything that would follow. The methods developed there, the ways of organizing labor and managing resources, would be replicated as the mission expanded. But Eridu would always be remembered as the beginning. It was the place where the Anunnaki first touched the mud and realized the scale of the task they had undertaken. The desperation that had driven them from the sky was now meeting the resistance of the earth. The long emergency was no longer a theoretical problem to be discussed in councils. It was a physical burden to be carried every day. The marshes of Eridu were the first testing ground for a civilization that was fighting for its continuity, and the silence of the records from that time reflects the intensity of that struggle. The station was not a temple. It was not a palace. It was a node in a network of survival. When we read the later myths of Enki and the building of his house, we are seeing the memory of this operational center filtered through thousands of years of human storytelling. But if we strip away the poetic flourishes, what remains is a story of engineering under pressure. A story of a crew trying to build a stable foothold in an unstable world. The descent of the Seven was the deployment of experts. The establishment of Eridu was the activation of a ground site. And the work that began there would eventually reshape the entire planet, not because it was meant to, but because the mission required it. The clay remains as the only witness to those early days, preserving the administrative details of a time when the heavens first made their home in the mud of the earth. The station at Eridu was the first of many, but it was the one that set the tone. It was a place of rules and requirements. It was where the first 70 who came down learned the limits of their endurance and the complexity of the world they had chosen. The texts suggest that they did not find what they were looking for immediately. There was a period of trial and error. There was a period of adaptation. But the mission did not pause. Could not. The necessity that had driven them from Nibiru was still present, still pressing, still demanding results. And so they continued to dig, continued to build, and continued to measure. Eridu was the starting point for a narrative that would soon encompass the entire globe, but in those first days it was just a small cluster of buildings in a vast and silent swamp, a fragile station held together by the me and the determination of those who had been assigned to the task. The logic of Eridu was the logic of the outpost. It was built to be efficient. It was built to be secure. It was built to facilitate the next stage of the mission. The descent of the Seven was the first sign that the mission would require specialized knowledge to succeed on the surface. These were the experts who ensured that the station could function in the long term. They were the ones who turned the marsh into a resource. The records of their deeds are sparse, but their influence is visible in every canal and every foundation stone. They were the engineers of the first reality. And as the station became stable, the focus began to shift once again. The ground had been secured. The station was operational. The resources of the Earth were now within reach. The next phase was ready to begin, and the hunger of the system was about to find its first true satisfaction in the depths of the Earth. This shift in focus required a move from the marshes of the south to the deep mountains and the hidden veins of the planet. Eridu served as the port, the point of entry and exit, but the mission demanded more than the marsh could provide. The scribes began to record the movement of the 50 toward the north and toward the west, as they looked for the specific materials required by the heavens. The administration of Eridu became the blueprint for these new expansions. Every new camp, every new excavation was modeled on the original station. The hierarchy remained firm. The instructions remained absolute. The crisis was still unfolding, and every basket of earth moved was a small victory against the fading light of their distant home. The story of Eridu is the story of how a station became a city, and how a mission became a civilization, born from the mud and the necessity of those who arrived with nothing but a plan and a deadline. The past breathes through these records, reminding us that the foundations of our world were laid by those who were simply trying to survive. For now, the focus settles on the ground that was broken, the water that was tamed, and the first house that rose where the rivers meet the sea. To look at the gold of the ancient world is to see more than a reflection of wealth. In the oldest Sumerian records, it is a substance of absolute requirement. It is listed among materials not for its beauty, but for its utility. While later cultures would come to see this metal as the skin of the gods or the currency of kings, the scribes of the river valleys recorded it with a different kind of focus. They described it as a material that served a purpose within a larger, failing system. When we peel back the layers of religious tradition, we find an administrative ledger that tracks a substance upon which an entire civilization depended for its very survival. Gold was the anchor of their mission. It was the driver of their descent. And within the logic of the tablets, it was the only material that could mend a sky that was slowly coming apart. The alchemical quest was not a search for magic. It was a response to an environmental drift that had reached a critical threshold elsewhere. The heavens, as we have seen, were not a static paradise. They were a managed environment. On the world referred to as Nibiru, that management was failing. The tablets speak of a thinning veil, a protective layer that was no longer capable of maintaining the balance of life. The heat of the sun had become a weight, and the warmth of the world was escaping into the void. This was the long emergency that dictated every decision made by the Anunnaki Council. They did not need a symbol of status. They needed a thermal regulator. They needed a material that could be processed into a fine particulate and suspended in the upper atmosphere to reflect the harshness of the sky and retain the life of the ground. Gold was uniquely suited for this task. Its properties are listed in the records not in terms of aesthetics, but in terms of function. It does not tarnish. It is highly reflective. It can be beaten into sheets of impossible thinness or refined into a dust that remains suspended. It is inert, meaning it would not react with the other elements of their atmosphere in a way that would cause further harm. In the language of the scribes, it was the substance that could heal the breath of the world. This framing changes the nature of the entire Sumerian narrative. The gods did not come to Earth to be worshipped. They came as miners and engineers. They came to harvest the one material that could buy their own world more time. The Abzu, that deep and distant region mentioned so often in the texts, was the center of this alchemical quest. While the cities of the marsh were the administrative hubs, the Abzu was the industrial heart. It was the source of the golden prize. The tablets describe the logistics of this extraction with a clinical detachment that feels remarkably modern. They record the opening of the veins of the earth. They document the movement of the ore to the processing sites. They track the refining process, where the raw material was transformed into the finished requirement. This was the alchemical quest in its most literal sense. The transformation of the earth into the salvation of the heavens. The urgency of this work is reflected in the way time is recorded. The scribes did not speak of progress in vague terms. They measured it in quotas. They measured it in shipments. They measured it against the cycles of the crossing, those rare windows of time when the worlds were close enough for transport to occur. If a shipment was delayed, the pressure on the home world increased. If the extraction slowed, the risk of total environmental collapse grew. This was not a project of choice. It was a mission of survival conducted under the most extreme conditions. Every person involved in the operation, from the highest supervisor to the lowest worker, was a participant in a planetary triage. The role of the me, those technical protocols we have encountered before, was essential to the success of this quest. The me provided the instructions for the refining of the gold. They contained the knowledge of metallurgy, of thermal management, and of the logistics of transport. To the Sumerians, these were the most precious possessions of the gods because they were the instructions for the system. Without the me, the gold was just a heavy metal in the ground. With the me, it was the key to continuity. Enki is often described as the one who guards these protocols in his house in the Abzu. He was the director of the alchemical quest, the one who ensured that the material was prepared according to the requirements of the sky. The toll of this quest was not just physical. It was institutional. The administrative records show a society that was entirely consumed by the need for gold. Every other part of the civilization was subordinate to this goal. The laws, the rituals, and the hierarchies were all designed to ensure that the extraction and the processing never faltered. This is why the Sumerian cities were so orderly and so focused on measurement. They were the supports for an industrial operation. The kings were the managers of the workforce. The priests were the keepers of the technical records. The people were the labor that allowed the gold to flow. When we consider the scale of the operation, the necessity of the primitive worker becomes clear. The gold was not easily accessible. It required the moving of vast amounts of earth. It required the clearing of deep tunnels and the management of water systems to wash the ores. The Anunnaki, as we have seen, reached a point of exhaustion. The alchemical quest had become too heavy for them to bear. The creation of humanity was the ultimate adaptation to this material requirement. We were shaped to be the hands of the quest. We were the biological solution to a geological problem. Our origins are inextricably linked to the gold that governed the heavens. The tablets do not describe the gold as being kept on Earth. It was a resource that was meant to be exported. The records mention the sky chambers, the vessels that carried the processed material away from the stations and toward the homeworld. This movement of resources is the underlying rhythm of the entire Sumerian era. Earth was a supplier. The heavens were the consumer. The relationship was one of extraction, not of partnership. This is a difficult reality for us to confront, but it is the one that remains etched in the clay. We were the byproduct of a material need that originated far beyond our own horizon. The legacy of this quest is visible in the way we still value gold today. We have inherited the fixation, but we have lost the context. We treat it as a symbol of wealth because our ancestors were taught that it was the most important substance in existence. But for them, the value was not in the price. It was in the function. They watched the gods labor for it, they were created to harvest it, and they saw it being carried into the sky as the only thing that could save the world above. The gold was the physical manifestation of the link between the two worlds. It was the material bridge that connected the mud of the river valleys to the thinning atmosphere of the distant home. As the narrative of the tablets moves forward, the alchemical quest remains the silent engine of every event. When kings were appointed, they were tasked with the oversight of the mines. When temples were built, they served as the collection points for the refined substance. When the gods argued in their councils, the productivity of the extraction was often at the center of their disputes. The rivalry between Enlil and Enki was, in many ways, a disagreement over how to manage the human workforce to ensure the success of the golden harvest. One sought to control through strict discipline. The other sought to adapt through biological innovation. Both were focused on the same outcome. The silence that eventually settles over the records regarding the gold is as significant as its earlier prominence. It suggests a conclusion. Perhaps the atmosphere was restored. Perhaps the crossing of the worlds became more difficult. Or perhaps the mission simply reached a point where the cost of involvement exceeded the benefit of the material. Whatever the reason, the departure of the Anunnaki coincides with a shift in the record toward human affairs and local governance. The alchemical quest had ended, but the world it shaped remained. The cities were there, the laws were there, and the people were there, still carrying the compulsion to work, to measure, and to look toward the heavens. We are the survivors of that quest. We live in a world that was organized for the extraction of a substance we no longer use for its original purpose. We inhabit the infrastructure of an ancient emergency. The Sumerian tablets allow us to see the administrative reality beneath the myth. They show us a time when gold was not a luxury, but a requirement. They show us a civilization that was forged in the fire of necessity and a humanity that was shaped to be its primary tool. The past is not just a collection of stories. It is a record of pressure and the lengths to which a people will go to preserve their existence. The alchemical quest was the first great project of our world. It defined the boundaries of our labor and the structure of our societies. It brought the heavens down to the earth and raised the earth up to the heavens through the medium of a single unreactive metal. And while the Anunnaki have receded into the silence of the past, the gold remains. It sits in our vaults and hangs from our necks, a persistent echo of a time when it governed the destiny of two worlds. The reasons why they came are recorded in the clay, waiting for us to understand that our history began with a substance that was needed to mend a sky we have forgotten. The story moves at its own pace, The gold is gathered, the atmosphere is mended, and the silence of the record begins to deepen. But the logic of the quest remains. It is the logic of survival, of efficiency, and of the administrative oversight that still defines our own time. We look back at the Sumerian scribes not as poets, but as bookkeepers of a cosmic crisis. And in their ledgers, we find the quiet truth of our origin. We were the hands of the alchemical quest, and we continue to live in a world that gold built. For now, the focus remains on the substance. The hunger is satisfied, the sky is healed, and the long emergency of the heavens has found its rest in the quiet weight of the earth. The narrative of the Anunnaki on Earth does not remain a story of successful implementation for long. In the earliest tablets, there is a period of quiet efficiency that slowly gives way to something much heavier. The shine of arrival and the clarity of the original plan begin to be eroded by the physical reality of the planet itself. The mission, which was born from a crisis in the heavens, now encounters a crisis of endurance on the ground. The Sumerian records are very specific about this transition. They do not describe the gods as being immune to fatigue. They do not portray them as beings who could simply wish things into existence. Instead, they show us a workforce that was reaching its structural limit. This is the moment where the administrative tone of the texts takes on a sharper, more anxious edge. The work was no longer just a task. It was becoming a burden that threatened to break the very hierarchy that had established it. If this space brings you any sense of calm, if the steady unfolding of old ideas helps the noise of the day loosen its grip, a quiet gesture of support through a like or subscription helps this small corner of stillness reach others. For now, there is no hurry. The story moves at its own pace the way these texts always have. To understand the mutiny, we must first understand the division of labor as it is recorded in the Atrahasis epic. The texts speak of two distinct classes of beings involved in the earth operation. There were the Anunnaki, who held the positions of authority, oversight, and command. These were the planners and the judges who remained primarily on the surface or in the administrative centers of the first cities. And then there were the Igigi. In later traditions, they are often called the younger gods, but in the functional language of the oldest tablets, they are described as the ones who bore the work. They were the labor force assigned to the physical extraction of the gold and the maintenance of the irrigation systems. They were the ones who descended into the deep mines and cleared the heavy silt from the riverbeds. The labor was not a temporary assignment. The texts describe a duration of toil that is difficult for the modern mind to grasp. For 40 periods, the Igigi performed their tasks. They dug the Tigris and the Euphrates. They opened the veins of the mountains. They labored in the heat and the darkness of the Abzu, the lower world where the gold was found. The Sumerian scribes use language that is visceral and repetitive to describe this toil. They speak of the weight of the baskets, the sharpness of the spades, and the way the years began to erode the spirit of those who worked. This was not the work of inspiration. It was industrial. It was systemic. And it was becoming unsustainable. The Igigi are described as beings with limited but real agency. They were not mindless automatons. They were participants in a mission they believed would have a conclusion. But as the decades turned into centuries, and the 40 periods of labor continued without relief, their perspective began to shift. The records suggest a slow, simmering resentment. They looked at the Anunnaki who remained in the comfort of their dwellings, those who issued the quotas and monitored the progress, and they felt the growing distance between the command and the cost. This is the linguistic fingerprint of a labor crisis. It is the sound of a system where the burden is no longer shared, but merely distributed. The mutiny began in the shadows of the mines. The tablets tell us that the Ijiji began to speak to one another in secret. They compared their grievances. They measured their exhaustion. They looked at their tools, the shovels and the carrying jars, and they saw the instruments of their own imprisonment. There is a sense of calculated preparation in the text. This was not a sudden, irrational outburst. It was an organized rejection of an unbearable status quo. The decision was made to set fire to their tools. This act was deeply symbolic. By burning the shovels and the baskets, the Ijiji were destroying the only reason for their presence on Earth. They were declaring that the work had ended because the means of the work had been consumed. Under the cover of darkness, the mutiny moved from the depths of the earth to the gates of authority. The Ijiji gathered their strength and marched toward the house of Enlil. Enlil was the counselor of the gods, the enforcer of order, and the chief administrator of the Earth mission. His dwelling was the center of command, and it was here that the Ijiji chose to make their stand. The texts describe the scene with a tension that is palpable. The house was surrounded. The torches were lit. The sound of the crowd reached the ears of the guards and then the ears of Enlil himself. This was the first time that the noise of dissent had truly interrupted the sleep of the planners. When Enlil was woken by the disturbance, his first response was one of alarm. He saw the fires and the gathered workforce, and he understood that the mission had reached a point of catastrophic failure. The tablets record his immediate call for a council. He summoned Anu from the heavens and Enki from the deep. The three great administrators of the Anunnaki system had to face the reality that their labor force was no longer compliant. This was not a theological dispute. It was a breakdown of the production line. If the Ijiji would not dig, the gold would not flow. If the gold did not flow, the homeland would remain in crisis. The stakes were absolute. The dialogue between the council and the mutineers is recorded with a clinical, almost legalistic tone. Enlil demanded to know who was the leader of the revolt. He looked for a single point of failure that he could remove to restore order. He wanted to punish the few to intimidate the many. But the Ijiji responded as a collective. They told him that every one of them had declared war. They spoke of the toil that was too heavy. They spoke of the distress that had overtaken them. They showed the council the ash of their tools as proof that they would never return to the mines as they were. This was a direct challenge to the authority of the command. In the council chambers, the debate reflected the same rift we see throughout the history of the Anunnaki. Enlil, the enforcer, wanted to use force. He argued for the execution of the leaders and the immediate return to work. He saw the mutiny as a threat to the stability of the entire cosmic order. But Anu, the father of the heavens, offered a more pragmatic view. He acknowledged that the grievance of the Ijiji was legitimate. He stated plainly that the work was indeed heavy and the distress was great. This acknowledgement by the highest authority shifted the conversation from punishment to adaptation. It was an admission that the system, as it was currently designed, had failed. It was Enki who proposed the solution that would forever alter the history of the Earth. He was the master of adaptation, the engineer of the biological and the material. He understood that force would not solve the problem of exhaustion. If the Ijiji were broken by the work, then a new kind of worker was required. He proposed the creation of a substitute, a being that could bear the weight of the basket, a being that could carry the spade, a being that would be fashioned to perform the labor that the gods themselves could no longer sustain. This was the birth of the concept of the primitive worker, the Lulu. This proposal was not born of compassion for humanity. It was born of the need to relieve the Ijiji and restart the extraction of gold. The Anunnaki needed a buffer between themselves and the physical demands of the planet. They needed a workforce that was suited for the earth but governed by the heavens. Enki's gambit was a technical solution to a systemic failure. It was the next logical step in a sequence of events that began with an environmental crisis and led to a biological intervention. The mutiny of the Ijiji serves as a reminder that even the most advanced systems have thresholds. The Anunnaki could cross immense distances and shape worlds, but they could not escape the reality of physical effort and psychological strain. Their divinity, as it appears in these texts, was constrained by the limits of endurance. The strike in the mines was the moment where those limits were finally crossed. It was the end of the first era of the Earth mission and the beginning of the era of man. The silence that followed the Council's decision was the silence of a factory floor waiting for a new machine to be installed. The Ijiji waited in the marshes, their tools destroyed and their hands empty, while Enki began the work of fashioning the substitute. The pressure had shifted. The urgency was now focused on the laboratory and the house of fashioning. The gold was still in the ground, the homeland was still thinning, and the survival of the system now depended on the ability of the administrators to create a worker that could survive where they could not. The Sumerian scribes recorded this mutiny not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. They understood that the world they inhabited was the result of this struggle. The canals they used and the cities they lived in were the legacy of a labor dispute that had occurred thousands of years before their time. They knew that their own existence was the answer to the divine exhaustion of the Ijiji. We were the relief valve for a system under pressure. We were the solution to a mutiny that occurred in the darkness of the deep mines. As the narrative moves forward, the focus shifts from the strike to the creation. The administrative records begin to detail the requirements for the new worker. The specifications are set. The materials are gathered. The long emergency of the Anunnaki was about to produce its most complex and enduring outcome. The mutiny had been managed, the strike had been settled, and the basket was ready to be passed to a new set of hands. Hands that were shaped to work, minds that were designed to follow, and a history that was forged in the heat of a divine rebellion. The minds were waiting, and the new era was about to begin, one that would fill the earth with the sound of human toil and the quiet weight of a purpose we did not choose, but were created to fulfill. Hello there and welcome back to Secretum Histories, where the past is allowed to speak slowly and the long echoes of ancient decisions are given time to breathe. Tonight we find ourselves standing at the threshold of the Bit Shimti, the house of fashioning. We move our focus away from the silent mines and the abandoned shovels of the Ijiji and toward a different kind of labor. A labor not of the earth, but of the blood. In the previous chapters of this record, we have seen how the Anunnaki arrived on this planet not as explorers, but as refugees of a collapsing system. We have seen how their mission to stabilize their own world led to an unsustainable burden of toil. Now, we arrive at the moment where that burden forced an intervention into the very fabric of life itself. The Sumerian tablets do not describe the creation of humanity as a singular moment of divine inspiration. They do not frame it as an act of love or a desire for companionship. What survives instead in the oldest layers of the clay is a narrative of engineering under pressure. The mutiny of the Ijiji had left the administration in a state of paralysis. The gold, which was essential for the atmosphere of the homeland, had stopped flowing. The Council of the Gods faced an existential choice. They could either return to the labor themselves, an option they had already found unbearable, or they could expand the system by creating a new kind of worker. This is the context for what we might call the Enki blueprint. Enki, as we have established, was the master of the deep, the administrator of technical systems and biological adaptation. When the council turned to him for a solution, he did not offer a miracle. He offered a procedure. The texts record his words with a clinical precision that feels remarkably modern. He pointed to a being that already existed on the earth, a creature that was compatible but incomplete. His proposal was to take the likeness of the Anunnaki and bind it to this existing biological template. The goal was to produce a Lulu, a primitive worker, a being with enough intelligence to follow instructions, enough strength to bear the basket, and enough resilience to survive the harsh conditions of the Abzu. The site of this work, the Bit Shimti, is described in the tablets as a workshop of high regulation. It was not a place of worship. It was a place of production. The primary actors were Enki and a figure named Ninhursag, often referred to as the Mother Goddess, but whose role in these early administrative notes is that of a lead technician. Together, they began the process of biological modification. The language used to describe their work is grounded in the vocabulary of mixing, binding, and purifying. They did not simply speak a word and bring life into being. They experimented. They tested. They failed. One of the most striking features of the Sumerian account is the record of these failures. The tablets describe several versions of the worker that did not meet the requirements of the mission. There were beings that could not hold tools, beings that could not see, and beings that lacked the structural integrity to survive the mines. These are not presented as tragic mistakes or as cursed entities. They are recorded as data points in a long process of calibration. The Anunnaki were working within the constraints of the Earth's materials and their own knowledge. Each failure provided information that allowed them to adjust the blueprint. This trial and error approach is the antithesis of the magical creation stories found in later traditions. It is the signature of an engineering project conducted under the weight of a deadline. The essential component of the blueprint was something the texts call the tema. This word is often translated as personality or essence, but it is tied directly to the blood and the memory of a sacrificed god. To create the worker, a specific individual from the Anunnaki ranks was chosen. His essence was mixed with the clay of the earth. In the secretum of these histories, we might see this clay not as mud, but as a biological substrate, a medium capable of holding the genetic instructions of the creators. By binding their own blueprint to the existing life on Earth, they were creating a hybrid, a being of two worlds, designed to bridge the gap between the divine command and the physical labor. When the first successful prototype was finally achieved, it was given the name Adamu. This name does not signify a father of all nations in these early texts. It signifies the first of the workers. The Adamu was the fulfillment of the requirement. He possessed hands that could grip the shovel. He possessed a mind that could understand the speech of the supervisors. And most importantly, he possessed the endurance to take the basket from the shoulders of the Ijiji. The relief that followed this achievement was documented not as spiritual joy, but as administrative success. The bottleneck in the extraction process had been removed. The system could once again proceed toward its objective. However, a single worker was not enough to satisfy the golden hunger. The blueprint had to be scaled. The tablets describe a process of replication that involved 14 birth goddesses, 7 for males and 7 for females. This was an industrialization of life. These figures were not mothers in the emotional sense. They were incubators, vessels used to multiply the workforce at a rate that the original mission could not achieve through natural means. The human story thus begins as a production line, a strategic expansion of labor capacity to serve a planetary emergency that was not our own. The Enki blueprint was effective because it was pragmatic. It did not seek to create an equal to the Anunnaki. In fact, the records suggest that specific limits were built into the design. The primitive worker was denied the longevity of the creators. The knowledge of self-replication was initially withheld. The Adamu and those who followed were meant to be a contained resource, a manageable population that would perform the tasks assigned to them and then recede when they were no longer needed. This was a state of controlled existence, a life defined entirely by its utility to the mission. The silence of the tablets regarding the moral implications of this act is profound. There is no debate recorded about the rights of the Adamu. There is no discussion of the ethics of creating sentience for the purpose of servitude. To the Anunnaki administrators, the creation was an instrument. Just as they had diverted the rivers and leveled the mountains to reach the gold, they had now modified the biology of the earth to provide the labor. The moral landscape of the Sumerian texts is one of absolute functionalism. What is good is what ensures the continuity of the system. What is bad is what disrupts the flow of resources. The implementation of the blueprint changed the relationship between the Anunnaki and the earth. They were no longer just visitors or miners. They were now the masters of a living workforce. This new layer of complexity required new structures of governance. The workers had to be fed. They had to be organized into gangs. They had to be monitored for signs of the same unrest that had crippled the Ijiji. The administration of the earth shifted from the management of machines and materials to the management of life. This transition is where the roots of human society are found. Our first cities were not built for us. They were built as the housing and the administrative centers for a workforce that was rapidly becoming the dominant feature of the terrestrial landscape. Enki, as the architect of this solution, occupied a complicated position. Because he was the one who understood the blueprint, he was the one who felt the first ripples of its unpredictability. Life, even when shaped for a specific purpose, has a tendency to expand beyond its intended boundaries. The Adamu were not machines. They were biological beings with the essence of their creators within them. This inheritance, though minimized, created a potential for awareness and ambition that the Council of the Gods had not fully calculated. The blueprint was a solution, but it was also a seed of something that would eventually grow beyond the control of the Bit Shimti. As we look at the records of the first human generations, we see them depicted always in the context of work. They are shown carrying the baskets to the temples. They are shown digging the canals of the Eden. They are shown standing before the supervisors in a state of quiet obedience. This was the era of the primitive worker, the time when the blueprint was most effective. The Anunnaki had achieved their goal. The gold was being processed. The sky of the homeland was being repaired. The long emergency had found its most reliable tool in the form of humanity. But the past is never static. The decisions made in the house of fashioning would have consequences that span millennia. The Enki blueprint was a gamble taken in a moment of desperation, and like all gambles, it carried risks that would only become apparent over time. The similarity between the creator and the created would eventually lead to a narrowing of the distance. The worker would eventually seek the knowledge of the master. The tool would eventually demand a voice. But for now, in the silence of the early tablets, there is only the rhythmic sound of the basket being filled and emptied. There is only the steady work of a species forged in a laboratory to save a world it would never see. The story of the Adamu is a reminder that we are the inheritors of a very practical beginning. We were designed to work, to endure, and to solve a problem of scarcity. This functional origin is the reason why our oldest memories are so heavily focused on duty, hierarchy, and the requirements of the gods. We were born into a system that was already running, and our first task was to ensure that it did not stop. The Enki blueprint was the logic of our arrival, and the weight of that logic continues to shape the world we have built for ourselves, long after the creators have receded into the stars. The narrative now moves from the creation of the worker to the management of the population. The blueprint had worked, but the success brought new challenges. The workers were many, and the earth was vast. The focus of the Anunnaki would soon shift from the Bit Shimti to the Eden, the restricted enclosure where the first experiments in human governance would take place. The mission was stable, but the world was becoming loud. And as the noise of humanity began to grow, the Council of the Gods would be forced to make new decisions that would lead to the next great transition in the history of the Blue Planet. But that is a story for the next layer of the clay, where the workers first begin to look up at the heavens and wonder about the purpose of the burden they were created to bear. For now, there is only the work and the quiet weight of a purpose we did not choose, but were designed to fulfill. When the first ziggurats began to rise above the sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, they did not appear as monuments to a distant, unreachable heaven. They were built as practical foundations for a hierarchy that was felt in every transaction and every heartbeat of the city. These massive structures of mud and brick were the physical anchors of a system that demanded order, measurement, and absolute compliance. In the oldest Sumerian records, the ziggurat is not described as a place where people went to find the gods. It is described as the place where the gods resided while they were on the ground. This distinction is central to understanding the nature of the Anunnaki presence. They were not abstract spirits floating in a realm of light. They were the living administrators of a world under management. The architecture of the ziggurat reflected the structure of the mission itself. It was a mountain of order in a landscape of shifting silt. The base was wide and heavy, rooted in the earth, while the levels rose in a sequence of terraces, each narrowing as they approached the sky. This was the visual language of the command. The higher the level, the more restricted the access. At the very top, in the inner sanctuary, lay the residence of the presiding authority. This was the seat of power where the decrees were issued and where the plans for the city were kept. The scribes record the maintenance of these houses with a level of detail that is almost unsettling in its realism. They describe the beds that were prepared, the meals that were served, and the clothing that was fashioned for the occupants. This was not the care of a statue. It was the service of a resident. The hierarchy was clear and unforgiving. At the summit of the system stood the Great Ones, the Anunnaki who held the seats on the High Council. These were the planners, those like Enlil and Enki, who dictated the movement of resources and the fate of populations. Below them were the lesser administrators, the minor gods who oversaw specific departments of the operation. There were those in charge of the canals, those who monitored the storehouses, and those who supervised the extraction of minerals from the deep earth. Every aspect of the city was a department in a larger corporate structure. The ziggurat was the headquarters where these departments converged. To live within the shadow of a ziggurat was to live within a system of total accountability. The Sumerian tablets are filled with ledgers that track the flow of goods into and out of the temple complexes. This was the mechanism of offerings. In later traditions, offerings are seen as acts of worship. But in the administrative layers of the Sumerian record, they look much more like a system of taxation and redistribution. The grain, the livestock, and the precious metals brought to the temple were not for a distant god to look upon. They were for the maintenance of the station and the personnel who ran it. The living gods required sustenance, and the city was the engine that provided it. The transition to human sovereignty was a strategic layer added to this system as it grew too complex for the Anunnaki to manage directly. The tablets describe kingship being lowered from heaven. This was the delegation of authority to a human intermediary. The king was not a sovereign in his own right. He was a priest-king, a middle manager whose primary duty was to ensure that the city met its quotas and followed the protocols established by the residents of the ziggurat. The rod and the measuring cord, the symbols of kingship, were the tools of a surveyor and an accountant. To rule was to measure. To govern was to ensure that the requirements of the high command were met by the labor of the workforce. The relationship between the sovereign and the living God was one of constant consultation. The records describe the kings receiving instructions in the inner rooms of the ziggurat. These instructions, often called the me, were the technical specifications for civilization. They were the protocols for metallurgy, for agriculture, for law, and for the management of time. The king was the one who implemented these protocols on the ground. He was the buffer between the high-pressure requirements of the Anunnaki and the day-to-day reality of the human workers. When a king was successful, the city was silent and productive. When he failed, the noise of disorder reached the top of the ziggurat, and the consequences were immediate. The physical presence of the Anunnaki within the cities created a unique kind of tension. They were seen, they were heard, and they were feared. Their authority was not a matter of faith. It was a matter of fact. They were the ones who had designed the irrigation systems that kept the desert at bay. They were the ones who had provided the knowledge of the stars and the cycles of the seasons. But they were also the ones who demanded the labor and the resources that made those systems possible. The ziggurat stood as a constant reminder of this bargain. It was the source of stability, but it was also the source of the burden. As the centuries passed, the records show a subtle shift in the nature of this hierarchy. The Anunnaki began to spend more time in the upper levels of the ziggurats, more distant from the streets and the fields. The direct interventions became less frequent, replaced by the strengthening of the human administration. This was the formalization of the distance. The ziggurats remained the centers of power, but they became more like remote command centers. The gods were still there, still requiring their meals and their accounts, but they were retreating into the inner chambers of their own complexity. The human kings were left with more responsibility for the daily grind, while the Anunnaki focused on the broader requirements of the mission and the communication with their own homeland. The hierarchy was also reflected in the way knowledge was distributed. The inner sanctuaries were the repositories of the most sensitive information. The mathematics of the heavens, the secrets of the biological solutions, and the true reasons for the mission were kept within the ziggurat, accessible only to the high priests and the kings. The common workers were given only the knowledge they needed to perform their tasks. This compartmentalization was essential for maintaining control. If the workforce understood the full scope of the operation, or the fragility of the crisis that had brought the Anunnaki to Earth, the stability of the hierarchy might be threatened. Silence and mystery became the tools of management. The living gods were also subject to their own hierarchy. The disputes between Enlil and Enki, which we see recorded in the tablets, were not just personal rivalries. They were jurisdictional conflicts between two high-level directors. One was focused on the command of the surface and the enforcement of the mission. The other was focused on the technical challenges of the deep and the adaptation of life to meet those challenges. The ziggurat was the neutral ground where these conflicts were negotiated. It was the boardroom where the fate of the city and the workforce was decided through a process of deliberation and decree. When we look at the ruins of these structures today, we see the erosion of time and the silence of the desert. But the stones and the bricks still carry the imprint of that original order. The ziggurat was a machine for the maintenance of hierarchy. It was a structure designed to facilitate the flow of resources upward and the flow of commands downward. It was the place where the heavens met the earth in a relationship of utility and necessity. The sovereigns who ruled from its base were the guardians of a system they did not fully own, and the gods who lived at its peak were the masters of a world they had been forced to inhabit. The legacy of this hierarchy is found in the very foundation of our own institutions of power. We still build centers of authority that rise above the landscape. We still operate within systems of middle management and delegated command. We still measure our success by the efficiency of our output and the stability of our order. The Sumerian scribes recorded the beginning of this pattern with a clarity that strips away the need for myth. They showed us that the ziggurat was the solution to a problem of scale. To manage a world, one must build a mountain of order. And to maintain that order, one must establish a hierarchy that is visible, physical, and absolute. As the narrative of the tablets moves forward, the distance between the sovereign and the living God continues to grow. The ziggurats remain as the focal points of the cities, but the voices from within them become quieter. The requirements are still there, the gold still flows, and the measurements are still kept. But the era of direct management is transitioning into the era of tradition. The living gods are becoming the remembered gods, and the sovereigns are left to navigate the silence of a system that was built to work, even when its creators are no longer seen in the streets. The hierarchy persists because it is embedded in the laws and the rituals of the city. The ziggurat remains as a witness to a time when the command was local and the living gods walked the terraces of their mud-brick mountains, overseeing the labor of a world they had reshaped by necessity. There is no hurry to reach the end of this story, for the structures it describes are still with us in the way we think about authority and the way we organize our own efforts. The Sumerian texts allow the past to breathe by showing us the practical weight of the decisions made at the top of those ancient stairs. The ziggurat was the heart of the cradle of civilization, a heart that beat with the rhythmic precision of a system that could not afford to fail. And as the sun sets over the ruins of Ur and Uruk, the shadows of those structures still stretch across our history, reminding us of the hierarchy that was forged in the lab, established in the marsh, and elevated to the heavens by those who needed a way to make the earth work for their survival. For now, there is only the order and the steady unfolding of a plan that was built to outlast the memory of those who first set it in motion. The narrative of the Anunnaki on Earth does not conclude with a grand finale or a sudden vanishing. Instead, it begins to dissolve into the silence of the records. If this space brings you any sense of calm, if the steady unfolding of old ideas helps the noise of the day loosen its grip, a quiet gesture of support through a like or subscription helps this small corner of stillness reach others who may need it. For now, there is no hurry. The story moves at its own pace the way these texts always have. When we look at the final layers of the Sumerian administrative canon, we see a shift that is subtle but profound. The language of direct command begins to fade. The meticulous logs of gold extraction, the detailed reports on atmospheric stabilization, and the clinical descriptions of biological intervention become less frequent. They are replaced by the language of kingship, ritual, and institutional continuity. This transition marks the moment where the Anunnaki began to withdraw from the foreground of earthly affairs. They did not leave because they were defeated, and they did not leave because they had grown bored. They withdrew because the mission had reached a state of equilibrium. The long emergency that had forced their descent had finally stabilized, and the world they had built was now capable of functioning without their constant, direct oversight. This departure was the final administrative act of a civilization that prioritized efficiency and stability above all else. In the logic of the tablets, a project is truly successful only when the creators can step back and allow the system to maintain itself. To achieve this, a buffer was required, a layer of middle management that could stand between the authority of the sky and the labor of the ground. This is the reason why kingship was lowered from heaven. It was not a gift of divine favor. It was a delegation of responsibility. The Anunnaki selected certain humans, those who possessed the right lineage and the proper training, to act as their representatives. These kings were given the rod and the measuring cord, the tools of the administrator, and were tasked with ensuring that the quotas were met and the order was preserved. The legacy they left behind was not just the physical infrastructure of the cities and the canals, but the cuneiform record itself. These clay tablets were the operational manuals of the mission. They contained the technical specifications for everything from metallurgy to law, from agriculture to the movement of the stars. The Sumerian scribes were not writing to entertain us. They were preserving the blueprints of a managed world. They understood that the knowledge they held was the only thing standing between civilization and the return of the chaos. The cuneiform legacy is the documentation of a handoff, the record of how a planetary mission was converted into a self-sustaining culture. The departure of the Anunnaki was thus a relocation of authority rather than a disappearance. They moved back into the background, into the inner sanctuaries of the temples and the distant regions of the heavens, where they could monitor the progress of the earth without being consumed by its daily demands. This distance allowed the reality of their presence to transform into the language of religion. The administrative center became the temple. The production quota became the sacrificial offering. The technical instruction became the divine law. By wrapping the operational requirements of the mission in the cloak of ritual, the Anunnaki ensured that the system would persist even as the memories of its true origins began to thin. What makes this transition so unsettling is the realization that we are still living within the logic of that original mission. Our cities, our hierarchies, and our preoccupation with the extraction of resources are the persistent echoes of an emergency that was resolved millennia ago. We are the stewards of a workplace that we have come to call home. The cuneiform legacy tells us that we were never intended to be the masters of our own destiny. We were fashioned to be the caretakers of a world built for someone else. And as the direct presence of the planners faded, we were left with the silence of the sky and the weight of the clay, trying to make sense of a purpose that was never fully our own. The withdrawal of the Anunnaki also explains the sudden stop in the evolution of human technology during the ancient period. Once the necessary systems were in place and the workforce was stabilized, there was no need for further innovation. The goals had been met. The system was designed to be static, to repeat the cycles of planting and harvest, of extraction and transport until the end of time. The silence in the stars is the silence of a project that is in maintenance mode. The managers have moved on to other concerns, confident that the protocols they left in the clay are sufficient to keep the earth in a state of predictable order. The cuneiform tablets remain our only link to that period of active development. They are the artifacts of a time when the gods were still architects and the world was still a laboratory. When we read them, we are looking at the notes of a civilization that was fighting for its own survival and found a way to use the earth as its instrument. The legacy is not just the words themselves, but the very way we think about the world. We think in terms of measurement, of ownership, and of authority because those are the concepts that were pressed into the wet earth long before our history began. As the narrative of Secretum Histories settles into this final segment, the focus remains on the weight of the silence. The Anunnaki receded, but they did not vanish. They left their image in our biology and their logic in our culture. They left a world that works, even if we no longer remember who it was built for. The departure was the ultimate act of control, a way of ensuring that the mission would outlast the presence of the mission leaders. The sky is quiet, but the record is loud. It speaks of a long emergency, a biological solution, and a legacy that is still being written in the dust of the river valleys. The transition from the administrative to the devotional is the most lasting part of this legacy. When the direct orders stopped coming, the rituals began. Humans continued to perform the tasks they had been taught, but they performed them now as acts of worship. The processing of materials, the distribution of grain, and the maintenance of the temples were all functional duties that became sacred traditions. The legacy is a world where work and worship are inextricably linked, born from a time when labor was the only way to ensure the continuity of life. The gods left, but the work stayed. Tonight, as we look back at the echoes of the void, we are reminded that history is not just a story of what happened. It is a record of what persists. The Anunnaki departure was the end of the beginning, the moment when the earth was handed over to the humans who had been shaped to carry it. The cuneiform legacy is the evidence of that handoff, a set of instructions that we are still following, whether we recognize them or not. The past is not behind us. It is the structure we inhabit. It is the steady unfolding of a plan that was built to outlast the memory of those who first set it in motion. The silence of the sky is not a sign of absence, but a sign of success. The managers have moved back into the void, leaving behind a planet that is orderly, productive, and deeply structured. We are the occupiers of that structure, the guardians of the clay, and the voices that continue the story in the absence of the narrators. The legacy of the Anunnaki is the world as we know it, a world of necessity, of labor, and of the quiet, persistent hope that one day the silence will speak again. Until then, we have the tablets, we have the marks in the mud, and we have the memory of a time when the heavens came down to the earth and stayed long enough to change it forever. The story does not conclude. It thins. It disperses into law, ritual, and habit. That dispersal is itself the ending. The ancient reasons still feel unsettling because they do not resolve into myth. They remain logistical, and logistics stripped of story reveal how fragile even the grandest systems can be. That fragility does not diminish what came after. It explains it. And so the story softens, becoming another quiet layer beneath what is familiar. A reminder that long before belief, before culture, before memory, there were decisions made because something had to continue. Those decisions no longer speak loudly. They do not need to. Their consequences are already here, folded into the shape of the world, steady enough to be lived within, strange enough to feel at times just slightly unfinished. For now, there is only the order, and the steady unfolding of a plan that was built to outlast the memory of those who first set it in motion.